So now we're going to hear about the social and political impact of the financial crisis. And to moderate this panel, we are very fortunate to be joined by Mercy DeMenno, who is a principal at MBD Consulting, as well as a senior fellow at the Global Financial Market Center here at Duke. So Mercy, thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I'm really delighted to be here, and we have just a fabulous set of panelists. So beginning to my left, we have Lawrence Baxter. Lawrence is a distinguished professor of law at Duke's Law School and also the faculty director of Duke's Global Financial Market Center, which of course is co-sponsoring this event. Then we have Brad Miller. Brad Miller is of counsel at Gutman, Bushner, and Brooks and a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives, where he represented the great state of North Carolina. And then finally, we have Fritz Mayer. Fritz is a distinguished professor of public policy at Duke Sanford School, where he also directs the Center for Political Innovation, Leadership, and Service. So thank you all so much for joining us. To kick us off, I want to set the stage a bit by hearing about the panelists' both backgrounds and also their perspectives about some of the most salient social and political impacts of the crisis. So could each of you begin by telling us, in 2009 or thereabouts, what your role was, and from where you sat then, what did you think would be the most lasting political or social impact of the crisis? And then tell us a bit more about your current role, and from where you sit now, do you still think those are the most lasting social or political impacts, or has your thinking changed, and why? So we'll start with you.
Sure. I was still in Charlotte at the time. I was not long out of Wachovia, where I'd been on the business side and rather complacent about how the economy was going. There were lots of warnings. Emma talked about warnings. I think back on them now, and there were a lot of them, but I had the optimist bias. And I assumed that there were always worrywarts around and that things would be okay. One of those warnings came from Robert Rubin himself at a fundraiser I went to, which he failed to observe either. When the crash happened, it happened so quickly, especially for Wachovia, which, if you remember any of the details, Wachovia ran into a massive, very sudden liquidity crisis and collapsed within about 3 days. Was essentially bailed out by Wells Fargo. We were partly in shock, but I was tracking it all the way through the night as the negotiations over whether Wachovia would go to Citibank or ultimately to Wells Fargo were taking place. And it was only slowly dawning on me just how massive this crisis was becoming. I greatly underestimated it, and I was very angry, and I thought that the immediate consequence would be that there would be a lot of executives and a lot of regulators in deep trouble. That's the initial reaction. Where I am now is I've been teaching bank regulation and derivatives and financial crisis retrospective up here at Duke, which I had been at many years before. And I've come to realize a couple of things. One is the lasting effects were much deeper and different from what I expected. This was typified by a remark of one of my very dear old colleagues, who's a professor emeritus now, George Christie. When I came back into Duke Law School, he came up to me and he said, "Lawrence, all my life I've never had to care about my bank. And now that's all I care about." And what it brought home for me was that this crisis had gone to the very heart of American society and probably the whole world. And that for that very reason, the causes and the fixes have become much more complex than I ever imagined. So I've said a couple of years ago, the longer I teach this, the less I know about why this crisis happened. I think what we're seeing, and we'll talk about this a lot later, is that it's gone to the deep societal level and been one of the series of shocks, starting with 9/11, that have prized open very deep fissures in American culture. I can't speak for abroad, but I do see some similarities there, and we'll talk about Brexit maybe a bit later. But it's also made it clear to me that there's no such thing as silver bullets, that there are some lessons, but they are very rare and far between. There are many more insights, which are different from lessons. But for various reasons, one can see what caused what momentarily, but to understand it from a systemic point of view is a much more complex situation. So that's the part where I felt like I've maybe acquired a little bit of wisdom.
I was elected to Congress in 2002 from a district that includes about half of Raleigh and half of Greensboro and the area north of here, Roxborough, Yanceyville, places like that. I perceived myself to be, maybe I was a little to the left of your typical Southern Democrat, but I thought of myself as fairly moderate, so I wanted to avoid the committees that had hot political issues, like Judiciary Committee, and wanted something that was more kind of backwater technical issues, so I got on the Financial Services Committee, which would never be at the fault lines of American society. I took the advice that to be influential in Congress, although not particularly visible to the public, pick some obscure technical issue and become your party's expert on that issue. So the obscure issue I picked was subprime mortgage lending. I worked with folks here in Durham at what became Center for Responsible Lending to develop legislation that was broadly based upon what North Carolina had enacted, and introduced that in March of 2004, but it had been in works for some time. So everyone knew that was coming, and that would be kind of the progressive alternative to what the industry was then pushing, which was really a very weak set of reforms, but would have had preemptive effect on any state legislation. And those were the issues that I worked on. One of the early crisis books by Bethany McLean and Joe Nocera was called All the Devils Are Here. And a couple of the early chapters were devoted to just how bad mortgage lending had become. And there was one sentence that said, there were proposals in Congress to rein in subprime mortgage lending, but nothing came of it. And I thought, that's 5 years of my life summarized in one sentence. Then in early 2007, Barney Frank approached me on the floor and said, we're going to pass your predatory mortgage lending legislation, but there are millions of families that are in these bad mortgages, and they're going to lose their homes to foreclosure unless we do something. Come up with our menu. Come up with proposals, what we can do. So those were the two issues I was involved in, which seemed to be the issues around which the nation's economy, and to a large extent our nation's society, unraveled. I swear it wasn't my fault. And then I was involved as a member of the Financial Services Committee on all the reforms of Dodd-Frank and all of those other issues. I'm something of a heretic. Sarah Bloom Raskin earlier used the phrase blame game like it's a bad thing. And Tim Geithner reportedly said in private during the crisis, there were some critics who would not be satisfied unless there was Old Testament justice. Yeah, I think I'm really more of a New Testament kind of guy, but I wanted to turn some people into pillars of salt. I think that there was bad conduct. This was not a perfect storm. There was blameworthy conduct, at the very least, pervasive blameworthy conduct. There was a great deal of criminal conduct, and someone with whom I generally agree, I think Steve Schwartz, said he thought, there were a lot of reasons for the lack of prosecutions, most of which there wasn't really that much criminal conduct. I don't agree. I think there was a lot of criminal conduct. And as I said, there was certainly a lot of blameworthy conduct. And I think there is a lingering anger among the American people that everything done to respond to the financial crisis was to prop up Wall Street, not to help ordinary folks, and that the people who suffered were relatively blameless, and the people who were most blameworthy suffered relatively little. In 1934, after 2 years of the New Deal, although Democrats had large majorities in the House and the Senate, and in 1932, of course, had elected Franklin Roosevelt, there had been two back-to-back very strong Democratic years. And most political scientists say that a real realignment in American politics takes 3 elections, one that kind of gets you in place, gets a party in place to adopt its reforms, a second one that really puts them in place, and then a third, after those reforms have been implemented, where the American people pass judgment on it. In 1934, Democrats gained seats in the House and the Senate and cemented a realignment that lasted for 2 generations. We had had 2 good elections in 2006 and 2008. In 2010, we got killed. And I think we got killed not because our policies were too ambitious, but because they lacked ambition, because they showed neither the imagination or the urgency that was required, and we were punished for that. Democrats in the House lost 63 seats, not mine, although 2010 was an unpleasant year for me. But in the House and Senate in North Carolina, Democrats lost control of both chambers. It turned out the Republicans did not really value my service, and they divided my district 6 ways. And I decided that I just did not want it that badly. In fact, I was kind of disaffected at that point. I've remained active in politics to some extent, mostly as an officious intermeddler. And I'm now at a plaintiff's law firm trying to bring about some of the justice I think didn't happen earlier, a decade ago, when it should have happened.
Great. So in 2008-9, I was then, as I am now, professor at Duke. And I was teaching a course at that time called Globalization and Governance, and also directing a program in Geneva on global policy and governance. So I was in Geneva a lot. In fact, in 2008, the summer of 2008, I've been spending my summers taking notes on the Doha round of the WTO, the multilateral negotiations, because it surely was going to be concluded soon, and there'd be a demand for the book about how the negotiations happened. And it was, you know, at that point in time, we were quite sure, and the sort of subtext of my course was all around, you know, how we were going to make globalization work. And there was a sort of sense, there were some tensions, yes, but by and large, the notion was that the era of history was really very much in the direction of what we call now the neoliberal order, that we were going to continue to expand free trade, that notwithstanding some of the hiccups, we would figure out how to make this system work. Really a kind of continuation of the whole Anglo-American neoliberal order, and by that, and by that we also meant the expansion of democracy. Real sense in which things were going. Now, when the crisis hit, I was blissfully ignorant of a lot of the details, and but I think the first reaction in talking with people there was a sense that, yeah, we have a bit of a crisis, but we'll weather this and we will get back on track. Initially, real concerns about protectionism, it might rear its head, but it turned out to be a little less than we feared, and the sense was we would weather this storm, and at least for many of us, there was a sense that this was, well, as you saw in the film earlier this year, that we would manage this and we would sort of carry on. I'm writing a different book now. So I sit at Duke still. I direct a center on politics here and have been thinking a lot about the tenor of our politics in the United States, and I could pick up on some of the themes that Brad just mentioned. But I'm also about to leave Duke, unfortunately, to be the dean of a school, the dean of the School of International Affairs at the University of Denver, the Corbell School, named for Madeleine Albright's father. And I'm now in the process of thinking about sort of what are the big issues in the world that should be the centerpiece of this school, and how do we think more strategically about them. And in thinking about that, and then thinking about this session, I realized just how profound I think the impacts of this event were on our politics and the politics around the world. And hopefully we'll talk about that in the course of this session. But I think it was in many ways, I don't know what we call it, a butterfly effect, or it had profound implications. I know there's been a lot of talk today more from the inside, but just on the ground, in a lot of the things that I think about and study, at least, even though I didn't personally experience, I mean, the depth of the pain in this country and around the world was profound. The extent to which the you could almost go to the point of saying the kind of social compacts seem to be broken in this country, the sense that if you worked hard, saved money, bought a house, did all those things right, you would be rewarded. The loss of wealth in the middle class was profound. I know there was some conversation this morning, the 800,000 mortgages foreclosed, the many people who came close to foreclosure, the many other people who struggled, the unemployment. This was a profound effect, and I think it had multiple effects in our politics, but I would say one of the fundamental ones was a kind of distrust of elites, a rise of populism, a rise of a lot of different, when you saw it in the form, obviously, of the Tea Party, you saw it in the form, to some extent, of Occupy Wall Street, but the tenor of our politics changed. In this country, 2010 was a landslide. It's easy to draw a direct line, I think, from 2008-9, and in fact, the enduring recession and the politics of 2010, the redistricting that took that followed thereafter, and it's not that hard to draw a straight line to Trump, and for that matter, today, Trump and Bolsonaro are meeting in the White House, and around the world, you saw different variations, but from Brexit, the kind of fragmentation, the fracturing, the loss of momentum of the EU experiment, the loss of confidence in the neoliberal order, the sense that we were all, that the world was coming to us. Freedom House does an annual assessment of freedom around the world, and every year since the Great Recession began, democracy has been in retreat around the world. Now, it's too easy to lay everything at the feet of the crisis, but it did put in motion, I think, absolutely profound changes in the politics in this country and internationally. So we'll talk more about that, but I missed it in 2008 and 9, and in hindsight now realize just how important an event this was.
You said 800,000, it was 8 million that lost their homes to foreclosure.
Right, 8 million, sorry. Yeah.
That's bad.
That's worse.
Yeah, that's a bad number.
So
I can still do math, that's good.
I think each of you brought up this sort of shifting trust in public institutions of various types and how you saw that play out over the last decade. Lawrence, I was interested, you mentioned the sort of shifting trust or awareness of private institutions, specifically people's relationships with their banks. So how do you think that the role of finance in society from a sort of broad public perception has changed? And what do you think the implications are either for society or for politics more specifically?
Clearly, finance itself is evolving very rapidly and is much different now than it was in the early 2000s. But I think the bigger change has been a sensitivity and awareness on the part of members of society to the importance of finance to their lives, which has helped to fuel anger because finance is very complicated. And so people feel frustrated that somebody up there on Wall Street or somebody in the bank down the street is screwing them. But they don't know why, and they are most of the time wrong. I actually share Stephen Schwartz's view that I think there was very little criminality, and I know that's a very controversial position to take, and disagree with Brad on that. I think it's been much more a case of people demanding punishment and the pressure, especially populist pressure on elected officials, has been to have them seem to be acting in some kind of either not necessarily punitive but decisive way at a time when they're not yet ready to act. Dodd-Frank was a heroic accomplishment, and I'd buy into about 3/4 of Dodd-Frank. But remember, it was passed under pressure about 2 years before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission reported. So we didn't even know what the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission had to take another 2 years to do. And then that FCIC report was itself fragmented by people who, put my cards on the table. I'm a registered Democrat, but I respect the views of the dissenting reporters because they have a very profoundly different understanding and vision of human behavior. So I think we're in a very confused state in which the emotions are there, but the clarity of what to do is not there. And I think that helps to account for why the big bank issue is going to be a significant political force in the next presidential election, but for both sides. And why it was on the Republican Party platform. And the last one, even though people on the other side say, but far from you doing something about the big banks, you made them stronger. It's just a high level of confusion because cause and effect is very difficult to isolate in a complex system, which is what our finance is. Maybe it was always complex, not quite as complex as now, but we didn't have to care about it much. Of course, back to the Great Depression we did. But even the dot-com boom and bust, I remember when that happened. I actually lost some money in it because I had a group of researchers who kept telling me to buy stock in these dot-com companies, and I started to believe them. But it was minor. It wasn't this sort of massive 8 million jobs lost kind of effect, which is not being forgotten, and the lingering anger about how it was dealt with has not been forgotten, is easily fanned as flames in political rallies and probably elsewhere, but certainly in the United States.
And so, Fritz, you touched a bit on how some of these sentiments, both the sort of shock of the crisis and then followed by this increased salience of the role of finance and of banks, sort of began to shape political identity. So talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think, anytime there's a crisis, people are looking for a simple explanation of why that's happening. And so we understand the great complexity of this. We understand, for example, that it could have been much worse. Right. But Paulson was a hero. That's not how it comes across in the society. And I think, to the narrow question, bankers were a convenient villain. I mean, right? So what's going wrong here? And I think in the specific, the bankers, but more generally, I think it contributed to a sense in which the elites in this country were somehow working against the interests of the real people in the society, that the elites that the system was rigged, that they, and I think there was a fundamental break of trust in that regard. So to some extent directed to banks, but I think it spills out to institutions like this. And if you go to Kinston, North Carolina, it's just a different attitude. There's a wonderful book by Kathy Kramer on the politics of resentment, careful conversations with people in Wisconsin, and and similarly the books on the Tea Party, the extent to which people interpreted what was happening and what had happened to them as them getting the short end of the stick. Where these other people, these elites, somehow seem to be doing fine. They bailed the banks out. They took care of them, but they didn't take care of me. So I think that this translated into a rather simple narrative. It's a familiar narrative. It's a populist narrative in which the elites are not on your side, and that is in painting with a very broad brush, was the thing that Trump tapped into, and that in fact is being tapped into in many other places around the world.
And so, Brad, you were talking a bit about the initial sort of legislative responses to the crisis. So bring us back to that moment, specifically with Dodd-Frank. What do you think that process teaches us for the current state of affairs? Are there key sort of shortcomings or things that you think the legislation did really well, and what do you attribute to those?
Oh, I do think there are a lot of shortcomings in the response. I mean, I think we were better off for Dodd-Frank. I think that the response, we could easily have had another Great Depression, which involved a much higher unemployment rate, much greater loss of value in the economy. It was worse. But we didn't follow what had been regarded as the standard playbook for how to respond to financial crises. It went back to Bagehot's time in the late 19th century, which was when you have a financial crisis, which happens with surprising frequency in developing and developed countries alike, you ruthlessly sort through which companies are illiquid and which are insolvent. And they're all going to say they're illiquid, but that's not true. Some of them are insolvent. Take the insolvent ones through receivership. The illiquid ones, you provide liquidity, but on punitive terms, so they will quickly get off the dole. And we did the exact opposite. And the decisions weren't publicly debated. They were, in fact, not acknowledged. And by comparison, in what we did with the homeowners crisis, the foreclosure crisis, although the foreclosure crisis in the Great Depression was less part of a bigger problem, less of the overall problem than it was in 2008, 9, and following that. That was addressed with much more imagination and urgency in the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and then following that, the reforms in the crisis. The lack of trust is very much a problem for a democracy. There's been a lot of discussion of the changes to 13G. Is that right? 13G or 3? Anyway, the provision that allows the Fed a great deal of latitude in responding to crises. And that was largely a response to a lack of trust. That the Fed looked to be an opaque, elitist organization. The two leading critics and I was not a particular critic of the Fed, except for not adopting consumer protections, which they had the legal authority to do. But the two leading critics in Congress were Alan Grayson, who's about as far left as you could get, a friend of mine, as far left as you could get, and Ron Paul, who's as far right as you can get. And the criticism of the Fed over time has come from the right and the left, and it's kind of conspiratorial. There's a book that I haven't read by someone I don't know, William Greider, but from the left, a book criticizing the Fed called Secrets of the Temple. So obviously a sense that it's a conspiratorial, sinister organization. And I think the reining in of the Fed powers is a result of that, and it may be a problem the next time we have a crisis. I think another very important consequential effect is not just income inequality and the resentments that come around that, but also the effect it's had on race relations in the United States. And no communities suffered as badly as did the African American community. The Latino community was close. African American neighborhoods were targeted for the predatory lending. There was a distrust of traditional banking institutions for understandable reasons because of the history. When somebody showed up who looked like them and said they could get them a good mortgage if they needed to refinance their house so they could handle some urgent need in their finances, they believed them, and they got in a predatory mortgage. And no neighborhood suffered as greatly as from the foreclosure crisis as did African American neighborhoods. It was, and there have been academic studies on how much loss of wealth there was for middle class families, for middle class African American families. I mean, it was an extinction event for the African American middle class. But the response on the other side, because believe me, in October of 2009, all of America was mad with Wall Street. I mean, across the board, everybody was mad with Wall Street. And that had to be fuzzed up a little bit. And a lot of you probably saw the movie Black KK Klansman. A lot of people liked it. I saw a lot of emails saying, oh, that should have gotten the best picture. I hated it. And the reason I hated it was it really created kind of a class stereotype of who racists are in this country. And I'm sure the class stereotype is right about who the people are who are in the Ku Klux Klan. But the narrative, the explanation for the crisis, that it was because liberals pressed banks to make mortgages to people who shouldn't have gotten mortgages, that was propaganda. It was not at all true. It was created from whole cloth after the crisis had hit. And it went right at that racial divide in America because you knew who they were talking about. The people that liberals made banks give loans to that shouldn't have gotten them, you knew who they were, you knew what they looked like, you knew where they lived, and that went right at the racial divide in America. And the folks who did that weren't the kind of folks that you saw in Black KK Klansmen. Those were folks who went to the best schools, belonged to the best clubs, work out with a personal trainer 3 or 4 times a week, know exactly which fork to use. And when they needed to divide America, they went right to the racial divide to do it.
So as you think a little bit about that process, you've highlighted what you think are maybe some of the underlying dimensions that have led to the Dodd-Frank Act being suboptimal in some ways. So another thing that I think each of you has talked about in some context is the role of sort of capture in some form in the policymaking process. And so something that comes up a lot in talking about Dodd-Frank, in addition to these sort of deeper systemic issues, is whether there was a failure of information. So was this a sort of technocratic problem, and was there then an opening for the sort of cultural or epistemic capture, or was it a lack of political will, or just an insurmountable ideological clash that led to some of these shortcomings?
A little of all of that. But the cultural capture and the regulatory capture, the cultural capture, the capture in thought was very real. Actually, in designing the structure of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I had worked with a group of scholars, what most people call professors, to provide an independent source of information. And I went to a group called the Tobin Project. A bankruptcy professor at Harvard Law School introduced me to them. She's now in the Senate running for president. And I approached them. And regulatory capture is initially an idea of the right, by the way. But I approached the Tobin Project, and they said, there is no scholarship on regulatory capture at all. And they were no help to me, but they published a volume of essays on regulatory capture. So probably 10 people got credit towards their requirement to publish. I thought, could you at least have mentioned me in the preface or something, having asked for this? But yeah, I mean, everybody wanted to be held in high regard by all these sophisticated, impressive people. And it was easy to be held in high regard. You just sort of puffed yourself up and you repeated what it is that, whatever the talking point was. Washington really cannot distinguish between gravitas and pomposity. So there were plenty of people who were thought to have gravitas who just said with great solemnity what it is that they were supposed to say. And as a result, there was very little independent thinking. The folks who were on the other side were professors with beards.
Careful now.
Yeah, who takes them seriously? And that was part of the problem. Now, I think since then, and there are broad parts. I mean, there was a set of advocates on consumer protection. So I could deal with them. I was dealing with folks on foreclosure crisis and how to deal with that. But nobody knew anything about derivatives. Nobody knew anything about shadow banking. Nobody knew anything about the repo market, which really did what precipitated that worst stage in, I guess, October of 2008 was a run on the repo market because of Lehman was borrowing $200 billion a night in overnight lending, which creates a real maturity mismatch when they were using that to make 30-year mortgages. Nobody knew diddly about any of those things. There were no sources of information available. I think there are more now. And I don't know if in 10 years or 15 years those sources will still be readily available.
It's interesting you said it. I can't speak to the specifics of this, but I have worked in the government and worked for several members of Congress. And so, going back to some of the earlier conversations this morning about, ultimately these are human beings making decisions under imperfect information. And from the outside, it's easy to imagine that, there's some kind of conspiracy or there's malfeasance. And my impression is most often, and I think what you're saying along these lines is, we haven't been there before, and stuff is coming at you really fast. And people, members of Congress are not well equipped to handle this. Well, for that matter, their staffs were not well equipped to handle this. Even in the inside of these institutions, very sophisticated, this is new territory. And so this was, I don't know what level of criminality there was in all of this, but I do know that in these moments, when you're trying to deal with these kinds of issues, it's very hard to have a real perspective on it in real time as stuff is coming at you. So anyway, what you say resonates with me. And the other thing I can say is when I did work in the government, the last person I wanted to see were any of my colleagues at Duke, because they really didn't know what was going on either. So I can understand that perspective.
I could tell my Matt Taibbi story. I was interviewed for an article by Matt Taibbi on the response to the financial crisis and on financial regulation, financial legislation. And the article quoted an unnamed Democrat on the Financial Services Committee who said, laughingly, that when the financial crisis hit, he had sat on his home computer reading Wikipedia about credit default swaps. That was me. And I think Matt Taibbi did not identify that congressman by name because he assumed that nobody would want to be seen as such a fool. But I think by the time I finished reading the Wikipedia article, I knew more about credit default swaps than anybody in Congress.
So we all have a homework assignment now.
Very comforting.
Yeah, we all have a homework assignment now.
Yeah.
So speaking of the sort of imperfect information, one of the things we've talked about a bit in each of your remarks is sort of the role that people's perceptions of the crisis and the responses to the crisis played in various election cycles. So we talked a little bit about 2008 and 2010. Lawrence and others, I'd be curious to know your thoughts about the role you think the crisis or the legacy of the crisis played in 2016, and then the role that you think it will play or is beginning to play in the 2020 cycle.
It's certainly playing a role to the extent that I think it continues half remembered and half understood events continue to fuel the vehicle of financial collapse as a means of obtaining votes on either side. Why I don't think we've gotten any more sophisticated about it is a much deeper problem, and that is, you're probably all familiar with Carlyle's description of economics as a dismal science. I believe it still is, but for very different reasons, and for reasons that are not due to any inattentiveness or sloppiness on the part of economists. It is because even if you take behavioral economics into account, as Emma showed us, really is a big advance. We were not paying attention to that earlier. You are still making assumptions about human behavior that will take decades to verify if they ever could. Especially under pressure. So we now have data studies coming out that are trying to model certain situations and using a data analysis predict what the outcomes will be. We've gotten a lot better than that. But when there is a crisis, that behavior is highly unpredictable because we have something like 90 and uncertainty, which is sometimes you just don't know what the outcome's going to be, and humans will behave differently. So, for example, to this day, the CFPB is highly controversial, and if you read both sides of it, you will have, just to oversimplify, you will have one side supporting it saying that people should be protected from abuse. Look at the hundreds of pages you get when you have to you go and get them notarized for a mortgage and so on. How can you possibly expect people to understand all of those? The other side says, you shouldn't take a loan unless you really understand what you're letting yourself in for. Well, the paternalistic view says that's unrealistic. You can't expect people to do that, and so we will protect them from it. But the other view will say, if you keep protecting people, they will never learn. Now, those views are very sincerely held. I happen to have the former view. I don't think it's realistic to get people to that level. But the people who take the view that people shouldn't borrow funds when they don't fully understand the terms, I don't think they're unreasonable. I think they are making a perfectly reasonable assumption about human behavior, about moral hazard, about incentives, and so on. And until we have some way of saying this is what human behavior will be in that circumstance, I think we will always get this sloppiness, and it will always be exploited, especially in election cycles, because it massages the ideological differences between us. And the very same story can make people on the right believe they have been validated and people on the left believe they have been validated. And I don't see that we've made a lot of progress in eliminating that fundamental uncertainty.
I can't imagine that if our democracy was working correctly, that we would ever have elected Donald Trump president. That just should tell us that things have come unstuck. But I thought things had come unstuck before that. Bernie Sanders began his campaign with the assumption, I think including by Bernie, that he would be a message candidate, that he would be the Dennis Kucinich of 2016. And I say that with no disrespect to Dennis, but Dennis was a message candidate who never cracked above about 5%. And Bernie damn near won. He got 47% of pledged delegates, saying essentially the same thing he'd said the whole time that I'd ever known him. Bernie has been, one of the advantages of Bernie is he does seem authentic because he's been saying the same thing. He's been saying that the United States was a corrupt oligarchy even before it was true. And I think that should have been a big hint to the Clinton campaign that things had come unstuck and they could not run as the presumed, as the committee had met and she was to be the next president, but people had to cast their votes. And in the last 2 weeks, in television ads in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, Trump was running ads that were to the left of Bernie. They were attacking Clinton as a tool of Wall Street. They were attacking her for the Goldman Sachs speeches. Now, was any of that sincere? No, of course none of that was sincere. But I think that's a pretty big indication of something gone terribly wrong in our economy and in our political system, in our society. And people don't have the trust in our political institutions they used to. I polled, after I'd done all this stuff, I thought, I've done all this stuff, I probably ought to ask the people I represent if they like it. So I polled it, and they loved it. I mean, I'd introduced the legislation that Sherrod Brown and Ted Kaufman introduced in the Senate to cap the size of banks, a lot of other things. And I tested it, and it polled extravagantly well. The problem was people didn't quite believe it. They thought, okay, he says he did this, but there's a catch. And that's a real problem in American politics. They don't trust their politicians. They don't trust their institutions. They think that important decisions are made behind closed doors by people who don't really have their interest at heart. And that's the problem for sustaining democracy, making democracy work.
I largely agree with that. I do think 2016, is exactly as you said. The phenomenon that some people were choosing between Trump and Sanders should tell you something. This was a protest vote against the elites. This was, this is not working. This was very much a populist reaction, and that was a central dynamic. And the Clinton campaign was pretty tone deaf. She ran as the I'll sort of keep it going, things aren't that bad candidate, which is a great message. And he's things are terrible, and I'm going to fix it. I alone can fix it. We're going to make America great again. But it was I have no brief for Trump, and he's a grifter and he's a fraud. But he was brilliant,
low life as well.
You could put that in there. What his message did resonate with people who felt like the elites were not, it was not working for them. And so it was just, there were other dynamics, but that was central. Now, the question for 2020 is whether we're still there, and the direct effects are attenuated over time, obviously. But nonetheless, I think the ripples are still there in terms of the polarization that exists in the society. And here we have a situation now where on the left, people are actively talking about socialism, for the first time in a long time, and very aggressive policies on Medicare for all or the Green New Deal, that would have been beyond, and then of course the president has decided, great, I can run against these socialists, but that dimension is very much related to this in some ways. How this will play out, God knows. In some sense, it will be a referendum on Trump, almost certainly, or at least in part. hard to know exactly how this, but this class dimension to it is going to be a part of the conversation. You can already feel it. It's already there in the campaign, and so I do think, as I said earlier, there's a relationship here, not just the financial crisis, but the aftermath of it, the extent to which it was part of, or it made more salient what was already happening, the Great Divide in America, by, in terms of wealth, but also issues around race, education, and the like, the ways in which we are quite polarized. And so that's the, not all, ultimately, you can't blame blame entirely on the crisis, the recession, but it certainly made those dimensions more salient and accentuated them.
So before we open it up for questions in just a few minutes, I'd like us to take a step back to sort of where we started, which was thinking about not just the political and social dynamics in the US context, but more globally. So I'd love you all's thoughts about how the crisis impacted the politics or society in other countries, or how it shaped international institutions or the sort of balance of power in the geopolitical landscape.
We can start with bank regulation.
Yeah.
About 10 years ago, while the Basel II principles, which were developed by the Committee of the Bank for International Settlements, were scorned for being only partially implemented and over-complex and not saving us from the last crisis, I think there was a strong general respect for the fact that we needed those kinds of institutions, and the Financial Stability Forum was upgraded by the G20 to a Financial Stability Board, given a lot more powers by the heads of state of the members of the G20. And it seemed like there was a common problem that we all faced, and therefore, while we wouldn't harmonize laws, we would certainly, while we wouldn't unify laws, we would certainly harmonize them so that global derivatives activities and that would be subject to basically the same rules. And yet these same fissures and forces have actually led to a collapse of that, to the point where there was even attempts to amend one of the bills in Congress over the last 2 years to prohibit the US regulators from applying Basel III, which was preposterous since we basically dictated the terms of it. But nevertheless, it's a strongly held feeling, and I knew you were going to ask something like this, so I couldn't resist bringing a letter from the Financial Times today. This was from 2 days ago, and when I read it, I was slack-jawed, but it is, as the UK heads toward a glorious re-establishment of its sovereignty through a hard Brexit, it is now time to consider its exit from other outrageous restrictions on its national rights. I'll skip the next paragraph, but then the following one says, Brexit is only the beginning. I await Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg bringing these matters to a national referendum and ultimately the complete liberation of the British nation from the evils of, quote, international agreements. That's written by an American professor of law, Case Western University, and I first thought, I got to check him out. It turns out he is not an ignorant man by any means. He was in the IMF. He has written quite eloquently on international terrorist financing and so on. And he deeply, deeply believes something that I absolutely do not, which is that international agreements are a form of enslavement. Now, if you've got somebody of that prominence adhering to this, we can't just reject it as this is the know-nothing party that just doesn't understand how international matters work. I think once again we've seen being brought out to the surface a very different conception of what it is to be a citizen and what it is to be a nation.
I represented Roxborough and Caswell County, and you want me to speak to global politics.
Well, you can pass.
But he will.
But I will. There's a reason I kept putting my name on ballots. One of the criticisms, or part of the commentary I saw after the Brexit vote, which came in 2016, well before our election, the discussion was, is this tell us anything about what our election will be like? One thing I read was, well, no, things are really different. There's a policy elite in the European Union, and there's a resentment that there's They're making these decisions, these arrogant elites, policy elites are making these decisions in Brussels that everybody else has to live with, and they're beyond the control of democratic processes. And there is a democracy deficit, and we don't have a democracy deficit in the United States. And I thought, the hell we don't. I think that there is a lot of the same resentment. Second, I think we've lost a lot of credibility in the world. Certainly with Trump's presidency, we've lost a lot of credibility in the world, but we've lost a lot before that. I think we don't have to have more of a discussion now about how much criminality there was. But when I did travel around the world on congressional delegations, CODELs and the lingo, we always got talking points from our embassy staff that when we met with with the government officials of that country, what they wanted us to say. And there was always some form of corruption they wanted us to really encourage them to come down on. It's usually petty stuff, They, not necessarily the people we would be talking to would be engaged in it, but the brother-in-law probably was. And we did. And I can't imagine that we have any credibility on that kind of thing now.
So I alluded to this in my opening remarks. I mean, I think it's had profound effects around the world, in Britain, in the EU, for reasons you're just talking about, the tension with Greece and the austerity measures that really have arrested the momentum of the EU experiment. It has reverberated, in Hungary, in Poland, in the retrenchment from democracy in a lot of ways. I mentioned Bolsonaro. We could look around the world. Now, again, not everything due to that, but I think the similar dynamics in every country: rise of populism, a rise of nationalism, a sense in which we want to return to national sovereignty, and therefore rejection in many quarters of the central tenets of what had structured the world order for a long time, going back to Bretton Woods and the enormous effort to create a global system of multilateral institutions intended to foster cooperation. And as I said at the beginning, a lot of us who study these things sort of imagine that the arrow of history was very much all in that direction and would forever be, and that is not at all what we're seeing now. The quote, from the Financial Times is, is indicative of, it's not universal, but of a retrenchment around the world. To me, among the many things here, though, and coming back to the United States, is, we were and have been for a long time the indispensable nation in this space. We were the architects of this system. We were, not just because of our hard power, but because of our soft power. There was a sense in which the world was moving towards us. Even looking at China, we imagined, pre-Tiananmen anywhere, that was coming to us. There was a notion that that's not there now. And I think the crisis was a part of, put in motion factors that have now, to a great extent, delegitimized that democratic liberal order as a model for the world. And we are at a point now of chaos out there in terms of what is the model? What is the way forward? You have a very vigorous China moving very, very rapidly and aggressively, and with some admiration around the world as maybe that's a better model. The polls show that the support for democracy and belief in that is the best system is decline, et cetera. So I don't mean to be, this is all very dark, but it is right now a chaotic situation. How much of this was, would have happened anyway? Hard to say. We were always going to decline. We were never going to always be the only superpower. But a lot of the forces put in motion or catalyzed, I think, by the Great Recession around the world are playing out now in very counterproductive ways in terms of U.S. interests and I think in terms of world order.
Well, on that somber but important cautionary note, I'd like to open it up to you all for questions for our panel about the social and political impacts of the crisis. Yep.
Hi, Ashton Work, History Department. I'm teaching a class of undergraduates this semester, and I realized that my freshmen were 8 years old in 2008, which is really terrifying for all of us. It makes me feel old too, but something that I would like to see all of you address is this generational shift that we're undergoing that matters for the difference between history and memory. Most of us who are in this room have some memory of the financial crisis. Some of it's more specific or direct than others for those who were involved. But the but the young adults in college today, some of whom, especially at Duke, may still be interested in going into finance, they have no working memory of the crisis, or they may have a very vague memory, which may feed into this politics of resentment, in the sense that maybe their family lost their home or their neighbors lost their home, but they don't really know why. So I'm just curious for your take on this, both in terms of what you're doing as academics or in politics, for this upcoming generation that may need actual information that they can't rely on their memory for.
I was recently the keynote speaker at a Model UN conference here in Durham. There's like 600 young adults there, and I gave a brief history of the world order kind of thing, bored them to death, I'm sure. But I felt like they needed to understand something about the Atlantic Charter and the history of Bretton Woods and the history of the international order and some sort of big, it was a big sweeping kind of talk, and they seemed to listen. But afterwards, a group of them came up to me and said, "That's the first time I've ever heard anyone say anything positive about these international organizations. Are they actually good for the United States?" I'm like, yeah, at least that's the way the rest of the world views it. And they had their flaws, and they were not democratic. We can talk about those flaws, but by and large, the systems work pretty well for us. And what was striking to me was that there was, the narrative I have in mind is of a world of chaos in World War II, and of America as the hero that figured out a way to restore order in the world in a way that advanced imperfectly, to be sure, sort of a humane capitalism and democracy in the world. And by and large, that worked well. And we don't know what the world without those institutions or without that ethos is going to look like. And so, yeah, there's a real loss here. But they had that story was not at all on their radar. I mean, that thing that many of us probably carry in our heads, that just was not there with them. And so I don't know if I helped, at least with the 12 of them who were gathered around me, or at the end, maybe I made a difference.
Any thoughts?
There's obviously a divide, a generational divide, and it is based upon experience, and not just the lack of memory, but the experience that young adults have had with the economy. There are lots of folks who were head over heels in student loan debt. They can't get out of it. The entry-level jobs and there were articles about this in 2009, 10, 11, that the folks who are getting out of college now, this is going to be a detriment to them throughout their careers because they didn't have that first job out of college that they needed to set them on a path. So the experience has been unfavorable, so why would you expect there would be a lot of support for the status quo or for the status quo that existed before?
When, of course, we've only focused on finance when inextricably part of this is technology, and that's the biggest influence I've noticed with students. But I'm a bit more optimistic in the short term, and that is, I ask my students, and they're a few years older because they come in as law students, how they experienced the financial crisis. So they were about 13, 14 now, and of course each year it's changing. And they usually say they remember that their parents were very worried. And so, like the Great Depression, which the impact of which lasted, I think, for at least 2 generations, somewhat confused by the war, I think they, at this stage, are concerned. Every year, my classes and the class that Lee and I teach is oversubscribed. We have to limit the numbers. I did a financial crisis retrospective last year, and I was limited to 10, and I ended up taking in 14 and had to reject others who were begging to get in. And many of them were not ones who had taken bank regulation, but they knew it was really important. So I think we'll see that continue for a while. It may not be true of the much younger ones as they age up, but at least this current wave of students who will graduate over the next 3 or 4 years, I think they may not have experienced it directly, but they know that it's really important. Now, if you say, well, how does it affect you? Not one of them has ever been into a branch. I ask them every year when they come in, have you been to a bank branch? It's not only that they don't put their hands up, I'm not sure that many of them even know what I'm talking about. How do you pay each other? And it's all Venmo and other apps. So for them, finance is changing dramatically. It's very retail-oriented and so on. But intellectually, I think they still think it's really important. That will change, I'm sure, as the younger ones age up and the parents age out, so they're no longer influencing that.
Other questions? Yes. I think she's coming with your mic.
All right. You guys have talked about how there's a distrust there, and my question is, when do you think there was a time there was trust, and how do you gain that back?
It's always been imperfect. But in the 1960s, even during the Vietnam War, when Americans were not really told the truth about what was going on, there was a question in polling then, do you think people in government most of the time try to do the right thing by most Americans? And that poll question got big numbers in favor. Yeah, people thought they might disagree with them. They might disagree with how they called it. But they thought they were trying to do the right thing. They don't think that now. I mean, I saw my own polling. People didn't have anything against me personally. In fact, I was relatively popular compared to other politicians. But when the poll script told them I'd done something that they liked, they were skeptical whether I'd really done it or whether there was a fish hook in there somewhere.
Yeah, if you take that particular poll, it's in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
At that point, there's that we were lied to. We didn't know we were being lied to, but we discovered that somewhere along the line. It drops, it drops, it drops. But we're now in the teens, high teens, in terms of yes on that question,
yeah.
And have been now for some time. But in addition to about government, the same thing around media. Do you trust the news organizations? The same thing across multiple universities. We still have fairly high trust in military and police, but across the board, there's been a kind of decline of trust of traditional institutions. And trust is a valuable thing. It really is. When you trust each other. The story we heard John Mack tell this morning, about trust between two people, how efficient that transaction is when you are able to trust each other as a society, in any circumstance when you don't have it. And we don't have it right now. So of politicians, of the Congress, well, you can ask it any way you want, and it is at a very low level right now.
In the 1960s has been a generation since the New Deal. And during that time, the economy had become more and more productive, and it was a broadly shared prosperity. Income inequality has shrunk dramatically to what it had been in the 1920s that led to the Great Depression. They were pretty, to use the Martin Luther King phrase that he actually copied from someone else, it did seem like the arc of human history was long, but it did bend towards justice. It had seemed to bend towards justice during that period.
Here?
Back in the back.
Who said that really?
The global crisis was largely happening because of the lack of checks and balances. For example, the rating agencies didn't think that the people will default on their mortgages at all. Do you think that in terms of legislative environment, the more checks and balances will be implemented further down the road to avoid this kind of thing from happening again?
I've got old guy ears. Could you repeat that?
So let me know if I'm summarizing incorrectly. The question was about how, whether there will be additional checks and balances introduced into the legislative process, specifically for credit rating agencies?
I don't know. There was a discussion of credit rating agencies, and I was not terribly involved in that part of the response to the financial crisis. I know that what Barney wanted was to find a way for their ratings not to be so important. But there was, as one of the speakers this morning said, there is kind of an inherent conflict of interest because they were paid by the people whose assets were being rated, which gave them even if you're an honest guy, there's something tugging at you subconsciously of wanting to get that business again. So I don't know. I think there were proposals to have it be, or have the rating agency be randomly assigned. That might have helped a little bit, but that hasn't been enacted, I don't think.
And what about sort of broader, I think you were also referring to kind of broader checks and balances as operationalized in the legislative process?
It's pretty hard to design a financial reform program that doesn't require regulators to act and isn't vulnerable at some point to those regulators becoming captured. Even when the reason they were given those powers is very much in the forefront of their thinking, that will pass, as the question earlier about the folks who are now young adults and they were 8 when the financial crisis hit. What will they remember, and will they believe, oh, that, a lot of the New Deal regulations were kind of treated in the politics of the 80s and the 90s as kind of old-fashioned, déclassé, sophisticated. That was when we were unsophisticated. That wasn't when we had risk models that assure that nothing like that, like the financial crisis of the 20s and the Great Depression, could never happen again. And I don't know a way. I mean, I think as much as we can create systemic protections that don't depend upon regulators, the better it is. I think if we, for instance, a capital requirement of capital of 20 or even 25%. That sounds like a lot, but it just means they retain their earnings for a couple years, and not pay dividends and not buy back their stock. But that would provide an enormous protection against having to bail out, face the choice between bailing out the economy, bailing out those institutions, and seeing the economy collapse. But there's always going to be a problem. The end of the movie, The Big Short, where I think the Steve Carell character says, the next time this happens, they're going to be blaming immigrants again. That really kind of wasn't funny to me. I mean, it was a funny line, but based upon my own experience, I don't think it was so much immigrants, but I think it was black folks that were blamed.
I think the problem is actually even deeper, and so I'm fairly optimistic that we won't see a financial crisis like the one we saw last. I think we're not giving institutions enough credit for the enormous advances in risk management, in capital management, and I would hope, I don't know much about the regulators, but I would hope in their awareness as well. I think it's going to be, Emma mentioned that the next crisis will come where we don't see it coming. And so I do believe we will have one. I'm very much a Hyman Minsky adherent. That is the instability hypothesis, that it's inherent in the nature of capitalism to have crises, and that the incentives are such that they are inevitable. We just don't know what's going to trigger it. It could be a war, for goodness sake. It could be Kim Jong-un. We just don't know. But I'd be very surprised if it's going to be the causes of the last war. I think it's going to be something different. Now, could be dead wrong. Maybe I'm being very complacent, but I used to be terrified of banks of the size of JP Morgan in 2012. I'm not anymore. I think they are so sophisticated compared to what they were like before that you know, you may have a general argument that they just shouldn't be that big, and I don't buy that argument anymore, even though I used to write about too big, that banks should not be as big as they are. I think we've gotten much better at that. You know, that's of course really putting my head out on the block.
Yeah.
But they said they were sophisticated before.
Yeah.
But they weren't aware of any of the things that caused the crisis.
I mean,
Yes, risk management, I will say, I remember visibly it was regarded as just a darn nuisance. And it was a place where you sent people like the British Civil Service used to send people to Ballymucky as a sort of promotion to nowhere. And nobody took them seriously. I totally get that. I don't think financial institutions or businesses intentionally set out to commit suicide. I think they really think they're doing the right thing, and it is our job to structure things so that they are not forced into situations or stupidly enter situations that are suicidal. But I also think that it's not going to be that, it's going to be something else that trips them up.
And I've been so negative. Here's a positive thing. I do think, you know, by and large, I agree with you that we face a crisis. We have evolved. We have once named thought of ways to regulate this better. It seems to me that's not. I agree with that. That's the next crisis is not this one. If I want to put a positive face on things that I do see, I do think the kinds of things that at least I've named with regard to American politics. I've said nothing that a lot of people aren't also saying that they're sort of on the case. I know here in North Carolina, something that I direct and that we pulled together a leadership forum. That's a bipartisan group across the board, business leaders, elected officials, and the like. And we ask people to do this and spend an enormous amount of time. They commit to 4 day-and-a-half sessions over the course of a year. Very busy people. No one says no. Everyone says, yes, I want to be a part of this. And so if you're looking for positive things, I do think there's a sense out there that things are broken. But there's also a hunger to try, at least in some quarters, to try to tackle this problem. So if we want to have a more positive note, I do believe in our capacity, once named, to address problems. And so this is a hard one. I don't know the way out of the box right now, but a lot of good people are working on it, including the students, by the way. And I said something about the high school students, but our students are, they're at least the ones I get to interact with are on the case. I mean, they see this as, that is to say, this crisis of trust in the society as a central issue for their time. At least some substantial number of them here at Duke, and that does give me cause for hope.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Okay.
Oh. Here.
All right, I wanted to start off by saying I think it's so ironic that anybody's giving credit to the British for kind of giving us a lecture on sovereignty, given their history of India, the partition, and the Middle East. Second question, what I had to say though is that that old Latin saying about to the victors go the spoils. And I kind of, I hear it a little bit earlier, and I've kind of thought this for the last many years, that we're sort of seeing this mild reinvention of what happened, and the comment that Ben Bernanke and Timothy Geithner and some others are really our heroes. It kind of depends on the perspective that you're looking at in defining a hero, and to me, I wouldn't necessarily say that. And I guess to some degree, I've wondered, would Main Street have been better off had we allowed some failures, some bigger failures? If you look at Tesla, for example, and you look at fintech, one might argue that what we did by giving TARP money or by the automobile bailout is we just basically gave the dinosaurs a lifeline and stunted the growth of Tesla and the future of automobiles. And we did the same thing to fintech, by not letting the bad policies, the bad ideas fall by the wayside and allow new intervention or new ideas to come to fruition. And I don't know, we're going to hear your thoughts.
I think we'd been a lot better if we'd followed Bagehot's playbook. And we had ruthlessly decided which institutions were insolvent. We had taken them through receivership, so they came out on the other side with new owners and clean books. We offloaded their bad assets to some other institution, like the Homeowners Loan Corporation or the what was it, in the 70s for the Savings and Loan, Reconstruction Trust Corporation, Resolution Trust Corporation. And that the ones that were insolvent, liquid, be provided liquidity, but on punitive terms. And instead we provided liquidity on remarkably indulgent terms to everybody, some of which were truly insolvent. We were not told the truth about a lot of things in the middle of all that. When I say we, I'm including Congress, the American people in Congress. Sarah Bloom Raskin, who's one of the good people in all this, I'm not criticizing her, but she said that, in the panic, there was a page-and-a-half bill, just give us $800 billion, and you can't do nothing about it. We'll do with it whatever we feel like. And Congress expanded on that some, changed that a little bit. But that wasn't developed in a panic. After the Bear Stearns attack, Neil Kashkari was assigned the task that it was called the break the glass memo of what to do if there really was a crisis like what we had with Lehman. We were told with respect to AIG, if AIG fails, there'll be widows and orphans who can't collect on their fathers or their mothers or their fathers or their husbands' life insurance policy when they die, and they were counting on those to survive. Well, they didn't have a damn thing to do with AIG. AIG was entirely about credit default swaps. The subsidiaries that wrote life insurance and all the other forms of insurance were separately funded subsidiaries, and I assume everybody here knows what that means. And it was all AIGFP, and all of AIGFP's credit default swaps were guaranteed by the parent, and it wouldn't have affected life insurance policies at all. And according to the trial, Hank Greenberg brought a lawsuit and had big deal lawyers bring it, and the evidence showed that if AIG had not been rescued and they had not been able to pay on their credit default swap positions, Morgan Stanley would have been bankrupt like that, and Goldman Sachs right behind it, and then who knows what would have happened next. I think one of the advantages of going that route is that an approach to a financial crisis that maintains market discipline is important. And I think one that is consistent with Americans' values is important. And we didn't do either.
And unfortunately, I think we have to leave it there because we are out of time, but we can continue this conversation in the reception. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a great